Hello, my name's Derek Bailey. I've been a wood turner now for over 40 years and taught for about 8 of them. My previous video a couple of weeks ago was based on designing a thread cutting jig, and I got it to work, thank goodness, and so I've made a box for it. Well, when I say for it, I made a box with it. With a screw threaded lid. I hope the video proves interesting. I can't emphasise enough, it's really bugging me is the wood I've used. I've had it for ages, but it's really heavy. It looks like cherry, but it isn't, because cherry is not as heavy as this is. And it's very hard. And yet when I start doing fine detail, it tends to crumble a little bit, so you could say it's quite brittle. So I've mentioned it a few times in my video about if anybody out there has got an inkling of what this timber is, let me know. I can't imagine what it be. The colours can vary from various timbers, so you can't just go off the colour. But maybe some of you have used something similar and have a good idea what it is. Anyway, enough waffling. Let's get on. For those of you who watch my previous video, you will have found out that I'm using an M18 bar, threaded bar in the vise, and I'm using a bush that brings up the M18 up to 1 inch by 8 TPI threaded bush to go into the chuck. Well, that was too coarse for doing boxes, so I need to make another bush that allow me to use an M12 threaded bar instead of the M18 threaded bar which you see at the moment, and that's what I'm in the process of doing. And I'm going to use the threading jig in order to create the bush. The bush that you see that I'm making is Purple Heart, which is a nice dense wood and machines reasonably well. As you can see, I've made a lousy job of the teeth, and that's my fault. I had the cutter cutting in the wrong direction. I was cutting anti-clockwise, I think that's right, instead of clockwise, because the cutters only have one direction of cut. Anyway, nobody's going to see it, and even though the threads look pretty awful and some burnt marks, it's still operable and it still works fine. I've temporarily placed an M12 nut into the back of the bush just to see how it goes on. I'll line it all up and then make it more secure by gluing it with super glue and some arrowdite. As you can see, it's not running true as I'm spinning it round, but we can sort that out later. It's just a case of getting the thing together and see about any caveats that might crop up. I've had this wood knocking around for years and I've used it for various things, some successful and others. It's a hard timber, but it is a bit crumbly, so it will test my threading abilities with the jig. So if anybody knows what it is by the time I've polished it up, let me know. This timber, although attractive in colour, it's a bit like cherry in colour. Like I said, it's hard and it hasn't always given me the results I've wanted, and here it is again, looming its ugly head and giving me a bit of a split, which I've got to sort out. Yes, I know, I could have made 2 tenons while it was between centres, but for some reason I just made one and put it in the chuck and then did the other tenon at the other end while it was in the chuck. So, c'est la vie, we all do strange things when we don't concentrate too well. I'm measuring the proportions here of the lid compared to the body. It's roughly about 2/3 body, 1/3 lid, unless you want to get extravagant and get a long lid or a very short lid. But that's the general rule of thumb. I think I've heard it somewhere, something about thirds being aesthetically pleasing. A general tip here, don't always take the tool rest out when you're sawing off anything on the lathe. That it's always tendency to slip and put a nice little nick in your tool rest, which isn't very nice when you're trying to turn. As luck would have it, the split's gone right through from the outer diameter to the inner recess I've just turned. So I'm going to have to get super glue. What I could have done, I could have mixed a bit of sawdust in it, but I was a bit wary that super glue goes off a bit too quickly, and I was frightened it to go off while I was putting some sawdust in, so I just used its natural effect without any sawdust. The depth of the recess is about 12mm. I'm going to cut a further recess in the back for the thread to run out, for the cutter to run out of. You don't want the thread going directly to the bottom of the recess. or else it could cause problems. You want a free space between the end of the thread and the back of the recess. I've made a little recessing tool out of an old chisel. Don't use files please, they're too brittle and they can cause serious accidents. But chisels, wood chisels, are fine for little jobs like this. I always put a little chamfer at the start of the thread. It helps the cutter to be introduced to the wood. If it's just a straight corner, it can put a bit of loading on the cutter and might just for a few seconds just make it run eccentric. Oh, that's a bit ugly looking. It reminds me of a scar on some human tissue. When trying to get rid of the little pip at the bottom, it's better to use a screw chisel or something like that, something that's flat if you've got a flat bottom, that is. Rather than a half round, because you end up getting a depression. You get rid of the pimple and you end up with a semicircular depression. But it's just a case of just waggling it very, very lightly up and down. Don't press on too hard because you'll just leave another mark. It's a very gentle process and takes patience, but once you get the technique, it's lovely to have a smooth bottom. Standard process again, up to 180 grit abrasives, and then using Yorkshire grit, followed by a bit of sawdust to give a key for sanding sealer, sawdust again for melamine. Unless you're doing food, if you're going to put food in, which I doubt in a box, but if you are going to put food in, always use food safe stuff. Melamine isn't really classed as food safe. I'm just remeasuring the depth of the threaded part of the lid and reproduce that depth on the outside of the base. Once I've established the internal diameter where the thread's going of the lid, I'll add about 3mm on. The depth of the thread is about 1.5mm, if not less. So I'm playing safe, and I'll make the spigot where the external thread of the base is going. I'll make it about 3mm larger diameter. For those who haven't noticed, I'm on my big lathe. This is the first time I've shown in any of my videos my big record power lathe. This is a bit better, especially when I'm doing lots of demonstration, is to remove wood reasonably quickly, which I can't do on the small mini lathe. But on this big lathe I can rattle in a big Forstner bit and just drive out the wood. Great. Oh crimes, here we go again, and this crack's even worse than the other one. I'm going to have to use araldite on this one and definitely mix some sawdust in with it. Notice I'm using a tissue for the application of the finish. Don't use rags, especially when you've got cracks. But I can guarantee if you use a rag, it'll find any sharp sliver in the crack and you could lose a finger or extremely damage one. So I always play safe and use a tissue. It rips far easier than a rag. I'm just rechecking the dimensions, making sure that I've allowed enough wood onto the external threads. You can never measure too much in wood turning, especially when you get carried away. Again, just making the recess at the back of the threads for the cutter to run out of without going up to a shoulder. In order to make the cutter run true, I've decided to use a tailstock live centre and put it into the hole before I put the cutter in, and then push it against the headstock and then tighten up these screws at the back of the cutter holder so that everything runs true by the time I put the cutter in the front of the tool holder. Here I'm setting the height of the chuck by positioning it in the jaws of the vise, and then once it's settled I'll get a packing piece to rest across the black bars in the vise so I've got a constant height whenever I use this jig. Due to some vibration it's not cutting the threads too well, so you've got to back it up with a bit of super glue and re-establish the thread. It keeps the thread form pretty decent and it makes it very useful. Like I said, nobody's going to look at it too much. Obviously the better the wood, like holly or hornbeam or some of the exotic woods which are a lot denser, would produce a better thread. But good old super glue comes in handy. Well, that's not turned out too bad. Now for the base. Now I'm cutting the external thread. You've got to be careful that the rotation of the cutter is now in the same direction of the rotation of the base. So you've just got to be a little bit wary of the cutter taking over the cutting action rather than you controlling it. Now I've mounted the base in the threading jig. The movement of the M12 threaded bar in the nuts in the vise is a little bit too much for my liking, and no matter how much I've adjusted the brass screws in the nuts themselves, I can't get rid of this movement. I think it's because the threaded bar isn't a consistent diameter, and the fraction makes all the difference. So I've the nut's tight. If I tighten it too much, I can't move the threaded bar, and if I leave it too slack, then there's too much movement. So I've got to come up with an idea to cut out this movement and get a decent thread. Here's my idea. I'm going to use a piece of scrap wood, pine, and put a thread in it equivalent to that in the vise, the threaded bar in the vise. And I'm going to use a scrap piece of threaded bar, put a slot in it so that I create a tap. It doesn't matter if the thread's a good one, as long as it can support the threaded bar in the vise. And I'll leave a little slot in the top of the scrap wood so that the vise also compresses the wood against the threaded bar and cuts out some of that movement. I've also shortened the threaded bar itself. There's no need for that much length to it. Flipping heck, it's here. I noticed I got everything right, got the main problem out of the way, and I forgot to tighten the blooming chuck up against the bush. So it's unscrewed slightly and didn't make a mess of the threads, but it made the threads a bit weird. So anyway, I managed to get away with it. There was enough wood left so that I could create a thread that would work. It's not shown in this video, but it was a case of trial and error to get the lid to fit to the base. And what isn't shown is the fact that in order to fit the lid and try it, I had to move the whole jig back along the bed of the lathe, and that's why I used the tool rest banjo as a stop, so that when I pushed it back against the stop, it was in exactly the same place for the cutter, so that I didn't do any secondary threads. As I'm making up the shaping as I go along, I just make sure that I've got plenty of wood to do any reduction in size, so I'm just measuring up the depth. I noticed as I was turning or preparing the wood to a cylinder previously that I used a screw chisel on it, but it tore the grain and pulled some of the grain out, so I can only assume from that it's a wavy grain, which I thought was straight grain. So I've had to revert to the spindle roughing gouge to produce a cylinder, and then I've gone to the spindle gouge for doing the shaping. Standard procedure: 180 grit abrasives, and then Yorkshire grit, sanding sealer, and melamine. I noticed the melamine when it's coming out of the bottle or the can, it dries a lot quicker than the spray on melamine. Anyway, that's by and by. Just a little info. If you just listen, you can hear vibration noise as I'm using the bottom edge of the spindle gouge to just clean up the base. That shows you how hard this timber is, so I've reverted to the screw chisel to just clean up, because I'm pressing along the axis of the lathe rather than radially, which cuts a lot of the vibration out. A little bit of stubborn torn grain here, but I get it out with a bit of perseverance. Well, I know it's hard to determine what sort of timber it is, but if any of you has a clue, let me know. All I can say is it's extremely hard to turn and very heavy. Thanks for watching. See you again.